Okay, hello everyone. This is Dr. Evans. Just a quick review over some slides that we covered in last week's class. Uh, so, moving quickly, the first thing we started with was revisiting action research, which was a topic that we talked about 2 weeks ago. Now, part of the reason that I wanted to emphasize action research is that for the EDD students, they'll be doing dissertations in practice. So many of you will be following something similar to an action research plan. In addition to the articles that we discussed, basically what I wanted to emphasize in class is that we're looking at this as like a cycle. So it starts off with the planning, uh, where you are identifying an issue, trying to gather as much information about it as possible, trying to figure out like what you want to do about it and developing your plan. Then you put your plan into action, which can occur in a bunch of different ways. So on this chart, it talks about trialing, collecting, questioning. Typically, with teachers, you'd look at more like of a type of intervention, or you might be trying to implement some type of program in your school. Then you'll be looking at or observing what actually happened following the intervention, and then your analysis reporting, and then how you share that information. So for action research, the component that's really important is the reflection at the end, because you want to evaluate what happened with your intervention plan and to see how it needs to be tweaked before you move forward. So this is pretty straightforward with probably how a lot of educational administrators do their work, right? You're constantly in a process of identifying issues and challenges and trying to come up with some type of plan. I think what makes this different, or what makes it action research, is that it's systemic in terms of your approach. One of the students in class made a really good observation that if you were to kind of stretch this model out, it really maps on to what we've seen in a lot of the research articles that we've been looking at. So thinking about the literature review, the conceptual framework as being the planning part, coming up with whatever your methodology would be, then the actual implementation of it and observing of it, that would track onto your methods, and then the reflection would really be like your findings and analysis section. Okay, so one of the things that I wanted to emphasize is that there's lots of different iterations of action research. So action research can be done as an individual. Oftentimes in education, we hear about that as like a teacher action research project, where you might be trying to try some type of intervention in your classroom. So participatory action research is a little bit different because it involves the researchers and the participants. Not all action research would necessarily involve the participants. So PAR is what we refer to this as. So that's when you actually have the participants working with you to try and understand whatever the situation is and trying to come up with that plan and however you're going to try and resolve it. YPAR, or Youth Participatory Action Research, there's a number of people in the class who are interested in potentially doing research with youth. If you really are not interested in doing research on youth, but with youth, like this could be a really good option for you. There's a lot of great examples. I provided some links, like the public science work that's being done in New York. There's a link for that in the Canvas site. That'd be a good thing to check out if you're interested in that. And then finally, I have community-based participatory action research, or CBPAR. Most commonly, you would see this in the health field, but we are starting to see more and more of it in education. So here it's just kind of like a broader take on this, where you're trying to get community input, trying to get community members involved in the design, implementation of the research projects. Maybe not people who are necessarily in your organization, but you're working in collaboration with them. The things that they all have in common. So if you're using action research, participatory action research, YPAR, or CBPAR, is the word action, right? So you're actually trying to do something. You're actually trying to implement something to try and solve a problem. So that's important to know, this emphasis on action, because not all action research is necessarily going to be the same as community engaged research, which is the other thing that I introduced a couple weeks ago. And so the reason for that is that you can imagine a situation where you just might be collecting information with no intent to have action. So you might be doing some community engaged scholarly project where you're working to basically gather information about a particular context. Maybe you're doing some type of like survey together, and you're collecting this information. But if there's no actual plan that's being put into place, then that would not necessarily it would definitely not be action research. The other thing that I think is important to emphasize is that within action research and any of these models, so PAR, YPAR again, um, and any of these, is that the research, all the different research tools are available to you. So you could do a participatory action research project that might be largely quantitative in nature. So I don't want people to think that this is just a qualitative thing, but you can use a variety of different methods, a variety of different research tools. One of the ones that I spoke about in class that I thought people would find interesting that you haven't been exposed to yet is photo voice. So this is a pretty common one when you're looking at youth participatory action research. Photo voice is photography-based approach. As you might imagine, if you're working with communities that might be intimidated by a research language, but you really want them to have voice and agency in the process, being able to take pictures is something that a lot of people might use or be able to use to help tell their story. So in photo voice, it uses photography. You identify goals, things that people want to look at. What is your research question going to be? And then your participants would go out and take photos of whatever these experiences are. And then you bring them back as a point of dialogue or as a point of conversation. And most often then it would result in a conversation with some type of policymakers or stakeholders. So it's easier to understand with some examples. I'm going to go through this more quickly. Okay, so here would be an example. This is a photo voice exhibit, and you can see at the top the question, what does it look like to live on less? So that's like the idea of a topic that people are interested in maybe knowing some more information about. So community members went out and took these photos to try and represent that. And through this process, what you would do is you come back and you have a conversation. So you start to identify what are some of the overarching themes, what are some of the important messages that emerge from that. Oftentimes, not all the time, but oftentimes you would have a photo voice exhibit that would result where you would invite other stakeholders then to start initiating a conversation. So you can imagine a situation at a high school where students might talk about the way that they feel that they're represented at the school. They might do some type of identity project, right? So let's say you're working with students of color and they're working on an identity project and they're taking photos of where they see themselves or where they don't see themselves within the school. Then you might hold some type of like public gallery or something along those lines where you would have maybe teachers would come or parents or community members or other policymakers in your district, school board members to start a broader conversation. But you could use those initial stories of the students in collaboration with them, right? Because if you're doing it as action research, you'd want them to be a strong part of that. We want to be careful when we're doing this work not to be using our participants, but to be working with them in collaboration. But we've seen this as researchers as being pretty impactful and a great way to start dialogues in communities. So it's just one quick example that people I haven't had a chance to talk about yet. Okay, one of the other things I wanted to emphasize, this is similar to the chart that you'd find in my article that I wrote that's posted up on Canvas. Just as something else that I wanted to emphasize is that if you decide to do something that's community engaged scholarship, that there's not one right way to do it. What's important is that you rationalize why or how you're doing something, not rationalize, but you're providing your rationale for why you made certain decisions. And part of your decisions in terms of how in-depth the community involvement is going to be with the research project is based on what their desires are. So you can see here that there's a bunch of different ways in which you might collaborate. So you could have outreach, you could do networking, you might be consulting with the community, but it can go all the way up to the highest level of shared leadership where you're heavily involved in every step of the way. Now I wanted to point out that this is not always the far end of the spectrum here is not always the best method, especially for the communities. So I shared an example of doing some work out in California and learning from some people who are doing some research with a migrant farming community in Watson, California. And basically, in speaking with the community-based organizations there, they didn't really have any desire. They wanted to help shape the research questions. They wanted to help shape what the survey was, but they had no desire to go out and distribute the survey. They had no desire to run the SPSS and to do the correlations and the coefficients and all that type of stuff. They did want to come back in for the analysis, and they wanted to come back in for the process of trying to kind of analyze the data and determine how they were going to use it then as a policy-making tool. So there's an example of where you wouldn't have a community group necessarily involved every step of the way, but that was based on their desires, and their argument was that they were too busy, that they had a lot going on, and that the expertise of the university, like that's what they were getting out of the relationship, was that they were increasing their capacity to be able to do some of the quantitative analysis that they didn't have internal expertise for. So I just wanted to make sure that I emphasized that point. We shifted gears in class then, and then we spoke a little bit about kind of revisiting this idea of academic rigor. I referenced some of the pieces from the Fundamentals of Research book. Those are pages that I think are worth revisiting, pages 41 and 23 to 24. And the reason I pointed students to those pages is because we don't want to fall into the trap with qualitative research of using quantitative means to assess it. So what I mean by that is that rigor is something different than validity. Rigor is something different than generalizability. So those are terminologies or terms that you would look for in a quantitative research study. You'd want to be able to replicate a quantitative study and to be able to crunch the numbers and come up with basically like the same thing. But that's not really the goal in qualitative research. So in qualitative research, we look for rigor. And so what we mean by rigor, and I provide some examples here, is thinking about so credibility, the completeness and accuracy of the data. And so what does that actually mean? So how did you do your sample? Like, does your sample size make sense for the question that you're looking at? Being very explicit in terms of like how you came to that determination. Looking at completeness and accuracy of the analysis and interpretations. So what are the methods that you use to make sure that your analysis was on point? So there's a couple different examples there. You can do something like peer debriefings. Did you triangulate your data? In other words, did you look for, if you saw a theme in the interviews, did you also see these same occurrences when you're doing observations or when you were looking at the documentation? And then finally, transparency, completeness, and disclosure in the final document. You hear this a lot in qualitative research. It's really good to provide thick description that really enables the reader to understand how you kind of like came up with your findings. But it's also going to be helpful for them too, if they're thinking about it as it relates to their own context. And so the argument is that collectively these components help to increase the usefulness and, I would argue, the academic rigor of your qualitative research. I next made the argument, and I'm drawing from the work of Mark Warren here. I posted this onto the Canvas site as well, the article, that in some cases, if we're looking at rigor, that community-engaged scholarship can actually be more rigor. Now, of course, it goes without saying that the research has to be well done, right? But what Warren argues is that if it is well done, that oftentimes community-engaged scholarship can be more rigorous for the following reasons. So first of all, you're going to have deeper relationships, which are going to increase trust, and then you're probably going to get more accurate information. Think about it this way: if you meet your new boss, you meet the new superintendent for your district, and he calls you in for a meeting, are you going to be forthright with every single thing that you know, like right off the bat? Probably not. Like, you're probably going to hold a few things like a little bit close to your vest until you get to know this person better, until you're able to build some level of trust. So as researchers, it's kind of, sometimes we're going in cold and we don't really have a relationship at all. So why would we expect an individual to be forthcoming unless they really know us. The other component is that in CES, in Community Engaged Scholarship, we work really hard to make our bias explicit. So all researchers have biases. We've talked about this in class. In CES, we're really making it explicit, and we're not hiding behind this idea of that our research is objective or using this to kind of as a shield from criticism, but we're saying up front that yes, like there is an agenda behind the research that we're doing here, and you're just stating that information up front. And then the final component that Warren and his colleagues talk about is accountability is enhanced. And so what they mean by that is that you're being held to a higher standard as a scholar if you are accountable not just to the people that you're submitting your work to, like a peer review process, or to editors, or to a dissertation committee, for example, but you're potentially also accountable to your students or to your community. And especially for those of you in leadership positions, you understand that there's other forms of accountability beyond just whatever your bosses require of you, that the community is going to hold you accountable as well. And so that happens in community engaged research. And so Warren and colleagues are arguing that it's these kind of three things that combine that can potentially make community engaged scholarship actually more rigorous. All right, so next up we talked about community engaged scholarship ethics. What I did here is that for those of you who have finished up your IRB training, I kind of pulled out really what we're looking at when we're talking about informed consent. So anytime you're working with human research subjects, you're going to need some type of informed consent, which is based on the Belmont report. And those basic principles are respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. So what do these things actually mean? So in research world, this idea of respect for persons and a participant's rights, it's talking about making sure that the research is voluntary, that the person knows what they're getting into, basically, that you're protecting special populations, so like kids, prisoners, people who might not feel like they have agency in the decision-making process, that you have thought about that. So what are the implications when you're doing just a straight up study with individuals? So have you thought about literacy levels? Have you thought about language issues? Have you made sure that you didn't coerce the people by offering inappropriate compensation, something like that? So that's pretty straightforward, but it's trickier in community engaged scholarship because if you think about it, how do you get consent? How do you get the informed consent of a community? Like who represents that community? So it's not as simple as just like asking the leader of an organization, unless you're researching that organization. Like sure, then they can give consent. But if you're doing research on a community, like you can't think about your own communities. Like, would you say that if the mayor of wherever you live signed off on a consent form to represent your community, that represents the consent of the community? No. So it's much more tricky than that. Some of the ways around that is I've seen people use like panels, or they try and get like a collective of people, and not just people in leadership positions, but a kind of a gathering of people who can kind of offer some type of consent, or at least provide introductions within a community. And even at that point, you still need to be pretty clear that, whatever your research is, it probably doesn't represent everyone in the community, but that you're kind of like doing your best to honor their positions. The next category is beneficence. So this is this idea that researchers work to minimize risks while maximizing benefits. So you don't push your participants to share information that might be harmful to them. You have to really make sure that the benefits are worthwhile. If you do expose if you are exposing your people or your participants to risks. And so that can come up, right? So if you're asking somebody to talk about something controversial, if you're talking to a bunch of teachers and they are kind of ripping apart like some type of policy, is that going to put them at risk in terms of their careers? If you're talking to a group of students and they start, they're not satisfied with some segment of the administration, then like could those students face potential blowback at some point? So what are the potential implications for community? Like that's why this idea of informed consent is so important that we talked about up above, because you know when you're talking about an entire community, you have to be make sure that they have bought into whatever this project is going to be, and that they're aware that there might be some potential implications for their participation. And it can get pretty messy sometimes. So just so you know, going into it, for example, what happens if some negative findings come out based on research that you did in a community, and you find something that maybe the community wouldn't want shared. Maybe there's a program that they're really excited about, but that the returns on that program aren't kind of what they expected them to be. Those are the types of ethical dilemmas that can come up. And then finally, justice. So making sure that we're not exploiting, making sure that there's a fair distribution of risk and benefit. You can think about this from, why are you working with a particular population? Are the interventions always being placed on the same marginalized population, or is that necessary, or could it be more fairly distributed in some way? And so when I think about justice, or this idea that you're not trying to just exploit a community, for a community engaged scholar, what they'd most likely be thinking about here is, so how committed are the researchers to the community? Is this something where as soon as the grant funding dries up that they're going to pull up stakes and they're going to be gone? Or are they taking on risk as well? Are they committed to the long term with their research participants to make sure that they're going to be able to weather the aftermath of whatever the issue is that you're working on? Okay, so this component, these are from another article that I posted. This was not required reading, but we did go through this. So for those of you who are interested in thinking ethically about doing research, I find this article on decolonizing research to be really good. I am emphasizing here that this is not a checklist. This is more about different practices that Dada identified as being potential ways to help decolonize research and to make it a little bit more ethical. So there's a bunch of different ideas on here. If you look on page 19 of that article, you can see that there's a rundown and there's one paragraph for each of these, but they talk about different strategies, like, the collective data analysis, for example, that you, as a researcher, you might analyze your data with other community members, that you're making sure that something comes out of the research, especially some of the students are interested in really doing some interesting projects, but they're also interested in some very serious issues. So if you go ahead and you do research on a topic, and you get all this information, and you're talking to these family members and to youth and all that, if it just goes in your dissertation and nothing ever comes of it, like you don't do anything with that information, you might actually end up harming relationships in that community inadvertently. So that's important to keep in mind as well. So I'm not going to go over each of these, but I'd encourage you to go in and then look at the headers here on page 19, and you can read a little brief paragraph about each one of these. And then the final portion of class, what we spent talking about, is we revisited researcher positionality. This is a cartoon you should probably recognize from the first lecture that we did in class, the first video lecture anyway. So we already know your experiences, identities, beliefs, and context will shape what you look for and what you see. So it's kind of a matter of perspective, right? But one of the things I want to emphasize is that positionality is not a problem to be solved, right? Positionality is just a reality that everybody brings their own experiences, identities, beliefs, and contexts to the table. Now, it's important to be aware of your positionality. It's important to be aware of your positionality so that you can negotiate that through the research process, and make sure that when you're your encounters with your research participants, that you're aware of that. So some of the things that we talked about is, so this is an identity wheel on the right-hand side. We did not do this exercise in class, but I just kind of pointed out that this is a common way to think about different types of identities. So to kind of, if you go through and like fill out that wheel, like that might be a way to think about your positionality. And then in terms of like interactions with, again, with your participants, to think about how that might be influencing those relationships, what data you're going to receive, how it might influence your analysis of the data that you're looking at, things like that. I had a handout in class so that we can get to you as well. This is by Gary Anderson. He actually wrote a really good book on doing an action research dissertation that you might be interested in checking out. But he basically talked about negotiating those insider-outsider positions. And then, let's see. So 2 more slides here. We're almost done. So from the reflections that people submitted earlier about their own positions, I wanted to emphasize that in addition to this like kind of classic identity wheel, there's other ways and other identities that people might bring in which would also influence their positionality. So one of the examples I talked about was if somebody's like kind of position themselves as like they're like the champion of a particular program. So they love that program, whatever program it is that they're in charge of. Maybe you're literally in charge of a specific position. So imagine that as a part of your positionality when you're doing your research, is that you'd have to be very careful and think to yourself, like, am I being, as I'm not going to use the word objective, am I keeping in mind that fact that I really am invested in this program? And am I coming up and I'm making sure maybe I'm having member checks? Am I making sure that the evaluation is really looking at all the different angles? Am I making sure that I'm not asking questions like, what are the, in what ways have this program like improved your life, right? Because that's a biased question. It's asking specifically about improvement. So you could reword that question as, in what ways has this program impacted your life? And that way you're not skewing it one way or the other. A couple of the other identities talked about that came up as some people describe themselves as being in the position that they're the boss. They anticipate doing a dissertation with people that probably are going to be that work for them. So being aware of that and making sure that people really know that it's okay for them to not participate if they're not into that. People who felt that the Avenger identity, that something happened to them that they felt wronged in some way. So they want to basically kind of change what happened to them, which is a totally legitimate reason to go ahead and like research something. I want to emphasize that. But you need to be aware of that because that's going to shape your mindset in terms of how you enter into the research process. So you see a couple of other examples up there. So how do you do this? How do you remain mindful of your positionality? The key here is ongoing reflection. You really need to make it a habit. Some researchers like to use journaling. Some people like to use memos. So like a memo is like when you're going through your data analysis, you're just you can leave, especially in those qualitative software programs, you can leave like a little note for yourself. Then basically you describe what were you thinking during a particular observation or during a particular interview. It's basically kind of like an annotation that you're adding in. Having critical friends who are you can talk to about the work that you're doing, and they can hopefully, if they're good enough friends, they'll be able to maybe raise a red flag for you if they think that you might be in danger of somehow unduly influencing your research. And then finally, like this idea of member checks, especially if you're doing community engaged scholarship, just making sure that it passed muster with the people who are having these experiences would be really helpful. Okay, so that's the rundown on what we did in class. It's a very abridged version, so I'd encourage you to talk to your peers and let me know if you have any questions, and I can go in things more depth in class.